One night, I found myself in the city, having finished work far too late, with no one but a few shadowy figures lurking near the empty streets. I had a choice: walk through an alley that cut my commute by nearly half or take the long way around. I'd heard about things happening in alleys, even close to the downtown police precinct, but I shrugged it off. Besides, what could really happen with police close by? As I entered the alley, I felt a prickling sensation along my spine, like a warning. The shadows seemed to deepen, almost pooling around the garbage bins, every step making my senses more alert. The dim glow of a security light flickered, casting an eerie glow that gave everything a sickly hue. Out of nowhere, I heard something, a slow scrape, like metal dragging across concrete. I spun around, but there was nothing, just my mind playing tricks, I told myself. Still, my instincts pushed me to pick up my pace, and I shoved my hands into my pockets, fingers wrapped tightly around my keys, ready to defend myself if necessary. That's when I saw them. Police officers. 2, maybe 3, standing at the other end of the alley under a street lamp. Relief flooded me, and I took a step toward them, ready to call out. But then, something made me pause. They didn't move, just stood there, back straight, faces cast in shadow. It was as if they were waiting, unmoving, almost like statues. A chill swept over me, and my mind scrambled for logic, searching for any reason why they just stand there. I forced myself forward, waving a little to get their attention. "Hey, officers," I called. "Everything all right?" One of them turned slowly, his face still obscured in the darkness. And then I noticed his eyes were wrong. Too dark, like they were empty sockets, but somehow staring directly at me. I froze, the words dying in my throat. He took a step toward me, his movements jerky and stiff, his arms hanging unnaturally at his sides. I backed up instinctively, my heart pounding. The other 2 turned to look at me, faces expressionless and hollow, their eyes, if you could call them that, locked onto me. Panic surged through me, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a stray garbage bag. They moved as one, stepping forward in perfect unison, each step measured and deliberate, as if they were toying with me. This wasn't normal. Couldn't be. I spun around, desperate to find an escape, and noticed a small alcove leading to another alley that fed back into the main street. Without a second thought, I ran, bolting into the darkness, the sound of my own frantic footsteps echoing off the grimy walls. I glanced back, and the officers were still there, their heads tilted in an unnatural angle, watching me go. But then, the footsteps behind me started again. I looked back over my shoulder, hoping to see another passerby, but instead I saw one of those officers. He was there, somehow closer, his head cocked to the side in a grotesque parody of curiosity, those dark eyes burning into me. I stumbled, the weight of dread pressing down on me as I took off running again. My lungs burned, but I didn't dare slow down. I heard them behind me, their heavy, synchronized footsteps echoing off the damp brick walls, drawing closer, even though I hadn't seen them move. Each step they took was agonizingly slow, yet somehow they kept closing the gap. Finally, I broke free of the alley, bursting out onto an empty street. The silence was unsettling. No cars, no pedestrians, not even the hum of city life that usually lingers, even in the dead of night. The shadows stretched out, twisting under flickering streetlights, and every corner felt like it held a threat. I glanced over my shoulder, breath-catching. They were still there, just at the mouth of the alley, lined up side by side, perfectly still like before. But now there was something else. One of them, taller than the others, held something long and dark in his hand. I squinted, and the faint glint of metal caught my eye. A nightstick. He was gripping it like it was meant for something far worse than just maintaining order. Swallowing hard, I reached into my pocket for my phone, my fingers shaking as I tried to dial 911. But the screen just flickered, then went dark. No signal. I cursed, smashing buttons in a futile attempt to get it working, but it was dead, leaving me stranded and utterly alone. "Help!" I yelled, my voice echoing down the empty street, bouncing back at me. But there was no response, only the thick silence that blanketed everything around me. The officers stepped forward, spreading out like a net, closing off every possible direction I could run. Their faces were now fully illuminated, and I wished I hadn't seen them so clearly. Their skin was too smooth, almost waxy, like they'd been molded from something other than flesh. And those eyes, dark, empty pits that seemed to absorb all light, making it impossible to tell if they were even human. I took a step back, my mind racing. How had they even gotten here? How were they moving so quickly, so quietly? I racked my brain, but nothing made sense. They were human, or they were supposed to be. And yet, one of them raised his arm, pointing straight at me, his fingers bent at an odd angle, almost disjointed, like the bones beneath weren't quite right. His mouth opened, and a hoarse whisper filled the silence. "Citizen," the word rasped out, thick and wet, like it was pulled from the depths of something decayed. "Violation will not be tolerated." With those words, the other two moved forward, their heads tilted, eyes locked onto me, as if seeing straight through me. I did the only thing I could think of. I turned and ran. I sprinted down the street, every nerve in my body screaming for escape. The sound of those heavy, mechanical footsteps followed me, relentless, echoing off the buildings like a death march. Every time I dared to glance back, they were closer, each step bringing them closer to my heels, their expressions unchanging, eyes fixed on me with that lifeless, hollow stare. The street curved into an old part of town, where the shops were boarded up, windows shattered and dark. I veered into a narrow alley, hoping to lose them in the maze of backstreets. My heart hammered as I skidded around a corner, finding myself in a dead end. Brick walls loomed high on every side, trapping me in their cold shadow. Panic gripped me. I spun around, hoping they'd lost my trail. But the moment I turned, they were already there, 3 shadows blocking the mouth of the alley. Their movements were unnatural, jerky, as if their limbs were on strings being pulled by an unseen puppet master. And then, in unison, they lifted their arms, each officer holding something heavy and metallic in their gloved hands. At that moment, a glimmer of light caught my eye, a fire escape ladder just within reach if I jumped. Desperation kicked in, and I scrambled up, climbing as fast as I could, the metal rungs digging into my hands. As I reached the first landing, I looked down, hoping they'd be retreating, or at the very least, struggling to follow. But they weren't backing down. One of them reached up, and with a swift, effortless motion, grabbed the bottom rung of the ladder, his dark eyes still locked onto mine. He began to climb, and his movements were faster, smoother, like he was gliding. The other two followed, clambering up the fire escape in perfect unison, their nightsticks hanging at their sides like dead weights. I bolted up the stairs, racing from one landing to the next, until I was nearly at the rooftop. My breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, the cold night air burning my lungs. I climbed the final set of steps, hoping that the rooftop would provide some way, any way, of escape. But as I reached the top, my stomach dropped. The building was high, surrounded by an endless expanse of rooftops with no obvious way down. I was trapped. Then, in a horrible silence, they stepped onto the roof one by one, spreading out like they were preparing to close in. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, empty and soulless, and their mouths pulled into faint, twisted smiles. "Citizen," one of them rasped again, his voice hollow, "you cannot run." My hands shook as I looked around, desperately searching for anything, any weapon, anything to defend myself. My fingers brushed against a broken metal pipe near the ledge. I grabbed it, brandishing it like it could somehow protect me. They kept advancing, their footsteps steady, calculated, as if they knew how this would end. I took a step back, nearly losing my balance at the edge of the rooftop, and held the pipe out in front of me, my last pathetic line of defense. "Stay back," I shouted, but my voice wavered, betraying my fear. They didn't flinch. One of them, the officer who'd first spoken, tilted his head. His mouth opened wider, too wide, and from the darkness inside, Something glistened. Something wet and sharp. A cold chill ran down my spine as he spoke again. His voice a guttural echo that sounded like it came from 100 throats. "You belong to us." The words echoed, hollow and unnatural, filling the cold night air. My grip tightened on the rusty pipe as I took another shaky step backward, feeling the edge of the rooftop under my heel. The drop behind me was at least 6 stories. A last resort escape I wasn't ready to attempt. But as they advanced, I realized that anything was better than letting them reach me. The lead officer, if he even was an officer anymore, continued to move closer, his empty eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that felt like it could pierce straight through my soul. His head was tilted, as if he was studying me, savoring every second of my terror. I forced my voice to stay steady. "What do you want from me?" He stopped, and for a horrifying moment, he just stared, that mouth still stretched too wide, as if he were grinning. When he finally spoke, it wasn't a response. It was a whisper, horrid and soft, almost like a lullaby. "End of shift, transfer of authority." The other two began to move in tandem, slowly circling around, their footsteps eerily synchronized. They moved with that unnatural, jerky precision, as though their joints were held together by invisible wires, manipulated by some unseen force. I could feel my options narrowing. My mind raced, searching for anything I might be able to use. There was an old ventilation fan near the edge of the roof. I bolted toward it, using all the strength I had left to wrench the cover loose. The metal groaned and gave way, leaving me with a jagged, broken piece that was barely big enough to grip. Clutching the sharp metal fragment, I spun back around to face them, holding it out in front of me like a makeshift weapon. They didn't seem fazed, but I could see the glint of metal in their hands, their nightsticks raised, as if in some ceremonial dance, moving closer, preparing to strike. "I don't belong to you," I shouted, barely recognizing the desperation in my own voice. Without warning, the lead officer lunged at me. I swung the metal shard, feeling it slice through the air, making contact with his arm. But instead of recoiling, he didn't even flinch. There was no blood, just a black, oozing substance that dripped from the gash, as if his flesh was decayed, hollow. The officer tilted his head to look at his wound, then lifted those dark eyes to mine. His expression shifted, mouth twisting into a snarl of rage. "You will comply." Before I could react, the other two closed in. I swung wildly, managing to keep them at bay for a moment, but their movements were calculated, precise, and relentless. One of them grabbed my arm, his grip ice-cold, fingers digging into my flesh like iron clamps. Panic flared as I struggled, twisting and kicking, but his hold was unbreakable. The other reached for my face, his hand unnaturally long and bony, as if his fingers had stretched, each joint contorted. I felt his fingertips graze my skin, a chill colder than any winter night seeping into my bones. My vision blurred, and my strength began to drain, like they were pulling something out of me. My energy, my will, my very sense of self. I was sinking into some abyss, like falling asleep but deeper, darker. Then, from somewhere in the haze, I remembered the ledge. With the last of my strength, I twisted, breaking free from their grasp just enough to throw myself backward. The rooftop edge came up fast, the ground below looming like an endless pit. But I didn't care. Anything was better than what they had planned. As I fell, the world tilted, the dark sky above spinning. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact, but it never came. Instead, I landed in something soft, the texture prickling against my skin. I opened my eyes to find myself sprawled across a thick pile of garbage bags, the stench and dampness overwhelming. My body ached, but I was alive. I struggled to my feet, looking up at the rooftop where the 3 officers stood, peering down at me. Their eyes burned in the night, cold and predatory, like creatures of pure malice. Then, in unison, they lifted their arms and pointed directly at me, their mouths stretching into wide, hollow smiles, too wide to be human. "Transfer of authority. Pending," they chanted, their voices merging into a guttural drone that rattled my skull. and then they stepped back into the shadows, disappearing into the night as if they'd never been there. I stumbled away from the alley, my body shaking with exhaustion and terror, knowing that they were still out there, watching, waiting. And as I ran, I felt their words haunt me, echoing in my mind. Transfer of authority, pending. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away, blending into the familiar noise and lights of downtown. Only when I saw other people, normal people, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the horror I just experienced, did I feel the tension in my body ease just a little. I slipped into a small coffee shop, collapsing into a corner booth where I could keep an eye on the door. My mind raced, replaying every second of the night, each memory sharp and jagged, like broken glass. What had they meant by transfer of authority? Why had they chased me like prey? As I sat there, trembling hands wrapped around a hot cup of coffee, I noticed someone watching me. He was a few tables away, dressed in a police uniform, but somehow he looked normal, tired even, and for the first time that night, I felt a flicker of hope. I decided to take a chance. I walked over to him, my voice shaky as I asked, "Excuse me, officer." The man looked up, his eyes softening. "You okay there? You look like you've seen a ghost." My mouth opened and all the details came pouring out. The alley, the officers, their eyes, the strange way they moved, the words they'd said. I expected him to look at me like I was insane, but he didn't. He just listened, nodding slowly, his expression growing darker by the second. When I finished, he leaned in, his voice low. "You're not the first one to report something like this," he said. "But there's nothing in the official records. No paper trail, just stories, whispers around the precinct." I blinked, heart pounding. "What are they?" He glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. "No one really knows," he whispered. "Some say they're an experiment gone wrong. Others think they're a form of, I don't know, spectral surveillance. Beings that somehow slipped into our world." I felt a cold weight settle over me. "Why do they look like police officers?" He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "They look like whatever gives them authority over their target. Police mostly, since people fear and respect them. Makes them easier to obey." Obey. The word chilled me to the bone. I could still hear their voices, their hollow chant. "You will comply." "So, what do I do?" I asked, desperate for any answer that could help me feel even a sliver of safety. The officer sighed, his face lined with worry. "Listen, kid," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "These things, they don't just go away. Once they've marked you, they follow. They wait until they find you alone, and they take what they're after. Sometimes it's your memories, other times your health, sometimes it's everything." I gripped the table, my knuckles white. "So you're saying they're going to keep coming for me?" He nodded, a grim look in his eyes. "But there are things you can do. Keep to crowded places, stay under bright lights, avoid empty streets. They hate places where they can be seen." I leaned back, the coffee growing cold in my hands. This couldn't be happening. My life wasn't supposed to turn into some twisted nightmare. But the officer's gaze was dead serious. "Most important," he added, "if you ever hear them say transfer of authority, run. Don't look back. Don't hesitate. Run as fast as you can, and don't let them touch you. If they do, well, let's just say you wouldn't be here to tell me about it." I swallowed hard, my mind reeling. But what does that even mean? Transfer of authority? The officer's eyes met mine, his face somber. "It means they're trying to make you one of them." A chill washed over me, and I gripped the table so hard my fingers hurt. I wanted to believe he was wrong, that this was just some elaborate prank, a horrible dream. But the certainty in his eyes left no room for doubt. He reached into his pocket and handed me a small card with a handwritten number on it. "This is my number. Call me if you ever feel them near. Sometimes a voice on the other end of the line can keep them at bay." I took the card, clutching it tightly, as though it were a lifeline. "Thank you," I whispered, feeling both grateful and utterly terrified. "Good luck," he said, his voice soft. "You're going to need it." As I left the coffee shop, stepping back into the cold night, I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see those hollow-eyed officers lurking in the shadows, waiting for me. But the street was empty, silent. For now, at least I was alone. And as I walked home, every streetlight, every flickering shadow, felt like a threat, a reminder that they were out there, watching, waiting. And the words repeated in my mind, a haunting echo that I knew would never fade. Transfer of authority, pending. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and growing paranoia. Every shadow seemed to twist into their faces, every creak in the dark a reminder that they were out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to keep to crowds, staying in brightly lit places, just as the officer had warned me. But as the days wore on, I noticed them again. Figures at the edge of my vision, shadows lingering just out of reach. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the product of sleep deprivation and fear. But soon enough, I'd catch a glimpse of that same chilling uniform and those hollow eyes, waiting silently at the edge of the light, biding their time. It became unbearable. The thought of being hunted, of knowing that they would never stop, gnawed at my sanity. One evening, I found myself back in that coffee shop, hunched over my phone, dialing the number the officer had given me. My hands were shaking as I brought the phone to my ear, hoping desperately for the comfort of his voice. The line clicked, then silence. "Hello," I whispered, praying he was there. After a moment, a low, familiar voice finally answered. But it wasn't the officer, not the one who had warned me. "We told you to comply." My blood ran cold, and I dropped the phone as if it had burned me, stumbling backward in horror. The number, my supposed lifeline, had been compromised. They had found me even here. Heart racing, I turned and bolted out of the coffee shop, not caring about the stares of people around me. I ran, ignoring the burn in my lungs, the ache in my legs, until I reached the street and my apartment building loomed in front of me. My instincts screamed at me not to go home, but where else could I go? I was exhausted, and the thought of hiding in my own space, even just for a few moments, felt like salvation. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, heart pounding with every creak and groan of the old building. I made it to my door, threw it open, and locked it behind me, breathing heavily as I leaned against the wood, praying for just a few moments of peace. But as I stood there, catching my breath, I noticed something that made my heart drop to my stomach. A shadow stretched across the floor of my apartment, cast by the dim light filtering through my window. It was long, twisted, and utterly still, and I knew with a sickening certainty that I hadn't been alone in the apartment. I turned slowly, heart pounding, and there they were, standing in the center of my living room. 3 of them, each wearing that same dark uniform, their faces hidden in shadow, their empty eyes fixed on me. They stood perfectly still, like statues, only inches from where I stood. And then, in unison, they each lifted a hand and pointed at me. Transfer of authority, complete. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, trapped by their gaze, feeling the very air thicken around me. I took a shaky step back, and my heel bumped against something on the floor. I looked down and my blood went cold. It was a police badge, my own name etched into the metal, as though I'd become one of them without ever knowing it. The room seemed to pulse, the walls closing in, reality itself folding in on me. And then I felt it. A cold, creeping sensation spreading from my fingertips, crawling up my arms, chilling me to the bone. My skin prickled as if something was seeping in, something dark, something that wasn't me. I looked up, and in the faint reflection of the window, I saw my own face, hollow-eyed, a smile stretching too wide across my mouth. The 3 officers watched, their heads cocked in eerie fascination. As I took my place among them, my movements jerky and stiff, the unfamiliar weight of the badge pressing against my chest. From somewhere far away, a thought flickered, a reminder of who I'd once been, the life I'd lived. But it faded quickly, lost in the void that had taken its place. Together, we turned and left the apartment, stepping into the night, our footsteps heavy and synchronized. I was no longer hunted. I was the hunter now, and as I moved, a single thought echoed in my mind. Haunting, relentless. Transfer of authority, complete.